Introducing Scott Ritter's YouTube channel, a platform dedicated to discussing the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Scott Ritter, an expert in international relations, provides in-depth analysis and commentary on the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. With his extensive knowledge and first-hand experience, Scott Ritter offers unique insights into the historical background, geopolitical complexities, and humanitarian aspects of the conflict. Join his channel to gain a comprehensive understanding of the crisis, including its impact on regional stability and global politics. Through well-researched and balanced content, Scott Ritter's YouTube channel serves as a valuable resource for anyone interested in delving deeper into the Russian-Ukrainian war.
Morning, good evening, depending on where you're watching from. Welcome to this edition of the Scott Ritter Show. As we speak, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, long awaited, long anticipated, is entering its second week. And if one is to take the reports from the front line seriously, from the Ukrainian perspective, they're apparently enjoying some success. There appears to be an opportunity for Ukraine to achieve its military objectives. If you take reporting from the Russian side, however, Ukrainian forces have failed to reach even the first line of defenses and are suffering horrific casualties, and the counteroffensive is stalled and failing and doomed to fail. The disparity between the reporting I think highlights what we're going to talk about on this episode, which is information warfare and the importance of getting accurate information, relevant information, and complete information when it comes to fully and honestly understanding what's transpiring in the special military operation today. And to do this, I couldn't think of a better guest than the one that we have today. Yevgeny Podubny, a extremely well-regarded Russian war correspondent, joins us today, and I want to welcome you, Yevgeny. Thank you for taking time to talk to me and to talk to this audience. I'd just like to start off. You're a war correspondent. What's your take about what's happening with these Ukrainian counteroffensive that's taking place today?
Good day, Scott. It seems to me that at the beginning of the program, you quite described in detail the process. The adversary, the forces of Ukraine, are trying to break several spots as the Russian defense line, and they are trying to do that with no success. It can be seen from the action of the adversary. I'm speaking about the progress. When the counteroffensive started, the active stage of this counteroffensive, because the counteroffensive has been going on for a long time, and the forces of Ukraine over several months have been trying to see the weak spots, the weak points in the Russian defense line in order to plan and master the action to break the front line. According to the management of the Ukrainian forces, there was a thorough plan, and then the active stage started, which led to serious loss not only in the people but in the armory and equipment, and with no success, with no tangible success, with no big area taken, with no serious damage to the Russian group of forces and the means in the special military area. Why is it happening so? What was the reason for that? So we can give three major points. The adversary overestimated its own forces and the potential of military equipment and weapons from the West. Even though there was a huge burden on the groups equipped with the Western weapons and prepared in the Western countries. So the adversary demonstrated that this combination with the sufficient number of troops, in particular spot of the area, was enough to break the Russian front line, but it turned out that it was not the case. Even at the stage of preparing for attack, the Russian intelligence saw the groups of the army, the battalion groups, the divisions, and very often even the adversary couldn't even reach the first line. So the forces were destroyed even remotely from the defense line. The second very important point and the second important factor which says that the potential of the Western weapon systems were estimated is the fact that the Western equipment and the Western weapons burn like the Soviet equipment burns, like Ukrainian equipment burns. So when there is a serious planned and modern intelligence means and equipment used, so it burns like every other equipment. And when there is a so the tanks turn into something burning on the battlefield. The infantry fighting vehicles of American and the British production has no sufficient armory and the system of protection to fend off the strike against modern anti-tank missile launcher systems and the system of fight management, fight control, the battle control with the modern radio-electronic warfare and loses its potential. It is important to understand that the adversary tried to during the first days of their active counteroffensive, tried to do the following thing. They tried to get the competitive edge over using this radio-electronic warfare, which was supposed to destroy the Russian connection. Unfortunately, there are some technical problems. So the connection to UAVs and between different groups didn't happen. So that led to no success. Where this radio-electronic warfare really succeeded, there were some alternative ways of control and connection, and the adversary was not physically able to destroy. This is particular secure satellite connection and so on and so forth. So the adversary didn't manage to paralyze the control and management of the troops, of the Russian troops. And so that's how the problems were suffered by the Ukrainian forces, which led to no result, to serious losses on the battlefield. Let's call them reputation losses and reputation damage when it comes to the producers of Western equipment and Western weapon systems. Undoubtedly, Germany, France, the United States expected that tanks, Leopard or Abrams tanks, Bradley vehicles would be able to provide for the required interconnection level of control connection, which was sufficient and which was required for this fast action, but that didn't happen. So the adversary, over a period of time, for such very active counteroffensive, is losing people, is losing weapons. So the offensive potential is diminishing very rapidly, whereas the Ukrainian forces haven't managed to break through the first defense line. We have a multi-dimensional, multi-tier defense line, the first, the second, the third, the fourth tier, well-prepared positions which cannot be broken very easily. Even everything is successful when there are no difficulties, but in the current situation, under the circumstances, we see serious difficulties in planning, in organizing the situation on the battlefield, and in motivation of the troops, as under any circumstances, even when there is some success, there are some losses and motivation goes down, but when there are serious organizational problems, so that leads to catastrophic implications, and that has played its own role, its huge role in the lack of success by the Ukrainian forces. Right now, from my standpoint, the Ukrainian regime is trying to understand whether they will have enough forces in reserved forces, which had been prepared for the counteroffensive, to break the sustainability of those Russian groups and divisions which are located on the front line. And Kiev regime has a dilemma between the venture activity, which may lead to the destruction of the reserved forces, and less aggressive, let's say, action, which, as a result, would lead to no result. And I'm going to explain to you why the first is a venture one. The Kiev regime understands that after Ukrainian forces may suffer serious losses and the potential of the reserve prepared within several months is by the whole collective West. I'm not talking only about the equipment and military systems. I'm talking about fuel, about ammunition. The whole set of the events was very complicated. Ukraine will not have enough forces and means to fend off Russian counteroffensive, and so the Ukrainian regime faces a serious dilemma. But due to political and military reasons, the adversary cannot afford no results on the battlefield. And right now, so the only result of the counteroffensive of the Ukraine is zero, is absolutely zero. Even though there are some tactical successes on separate areas, they cannot even stay with this success and let alone develop in this success. Therefore, we see that it might lead us to the situation and purely prepared and purely executed offensive together with the NATO, Kiev regime may find itself not in a catastrophic situation for the Ukrainian forces, but it may lead to serious weakening of the forces due to a reactive reduction in the reserve, in diminishing potential of those forces, which we can see on the battlefield right now.
Well, thank you very much for that, that very detailed and, I mean, accurate, if you're Ukrainian or a Western supporter of Ukraine, depressing report from the field. You know, what's interesting is that what you have just said is starting to be echoed in mainstream Western media. We start to see reports in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Wall Street Journal that mirror what you just said, the reality. I think what this highlights is the inadequacy of the reporting that has been taking place up until this counteroffensive on the part of your counterparts in the West. American journalists, British journalists, Ukrainian journalists who have allowed themselves to be deceived and to report inaccurately about both Ukrainian capabilities and Russian capabilities. What I want to ask you is, from the perspective of a Russian journalist, have the Russian successes taken you by surprise? Were you surprised by the performance of the Russian troops? Leading up to this counteroffensive, there was a lot of questions, even in Russian media, about whether or not the mobilized forces would perform well in combat, whether or not their training was sufficient, their equipment was sufficient, their morale was sufficient, whether or not Russian leadership was capable of coordinating artillery and air defense. Many people question whether or not Russia could, in fact, defend itself from the kind of attack that Ukraine has put forward. Were you surprised, or did you expect this outcome?
You know, for me, it was not a surprise at all. The losses and the lack of success of adversary on the front line. It is worth mentioning that the only concern and the co-concern
Okay, well, it looks like we had a break. This is one of the difficulties of reporting from a war zone, and Yevgeny is indeed reporting from a war zone, and so it's the hazard of the task. One of the things that we should point out is that Yevgeny, along with other Russian journalists, had the opportunity to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin recently, and one of the things that I was hoping to be able to explore with Yevgeny was the role played by not just mainstream Russian journalists such as himself who report for the larger television stations, but the role played by Russian bloggers. And here we come. Thank you for rejoining. I understand the difficulty of trying to report from the front line, so I appreciate you coming back. If you'd like to continue your answer, go ahead, please.
Yes, of course. I'd like to reiterate that it was not a surprise to me at all, this failure of Ukrainian regime and Ukrainian forces. We need to understand that the whole concern in the Russian passionate people, Russian patriotic circles, those people who love their homeland, is our domestic thing, is our domestic state of affairs. And no single event which touches and concerns such very sensitive points can not lead to no concern. And these things are discussed in the public field, but it doesn't imply that the real picture, the real state of affairs should necessarily be catastrophic. And so the preparation for a possible Ukrainian counteroffensive would bear fruit, and we realized that it would bear, and there was no doubt about that. Another question was about the difficulties which the vital component in any preparation. And another important aspect is that the Russian Ministry of Defense didn't fall into a trap of self-admiration and complacency. So the Russian generals respect adversary, and we're not talking about the Kiev regime, but about all the Western countries. Unfortunately, there are some connection issues again.
Again, we're in a pause in terms of our connectivity. The difficulties of reporting from the front lines of an active war zone, where there's a lot of electronic warfare taking place. Getting a reliable signal is not as easy as some would believe. I would like to point out that our guest today is a veteran combat reporter who has reported from war zones, not just in Ukraine, but he made his reputation reporting from Syria. Very effective, very informative reports from Syria during the heavy fighting that took place there, and also from North Africa and other war zones. He has received numerous awards for his work. He has been decorated for courage, and a war correspondent oftentimes is called upon to perform acts of extreme courage in an effort to report the story from the front line. And that's the quality and character of of Yevgeny, who joins us. I don't know if we're going to be able to get his connectivity back, so what I'll do now is I'll just explore some of the thematics that I was hoping to discuss with him. One deals with the role played by the Russian leadership in coordinating, information with a press. The Russian media has been castigated here in the West as little more than a propaganda arm of the Russian government. But I think, as Yevgeny alluded to, there's actually a much more vibrant, Russian media than the West gives Russia credit for, especially in the blogosphere, where on social media, Telegram channels, and such, these informal war correspondents report, again, using extreme courage and dedication from the front lines, but they have more of an earthy tone to them. They're not reporting the official side of the story, but rather the unofficial side of the story is told by men on the ground doing the fighting, on families whose fathers, brothers, uncles are doing the fighting. And oftentimes there seems to be a disparity between the tone and tenor of the reporting from these social media blogs and the official reporting coming from Moscow. And it was curious that Russian President Vladimir Putin held a meeting with these war correspondents, not just the official war correspondents such as Yevgeny, but people from the social media, these bloggers, Telegram channel operators, all came together and had an opportunity to have a very lengthy, in-depth discussion with the Russian president about, the war, the conflict, and reporting. And I was really curious to get Yevgeny's take on the accessibility of the Russian president and how he felt about the having the opportunity to question the commander-in-chief about sensitive activities in an ongoing conflict. The other aspect that I was hoping to pursue was, again, the concept of information war. We live in a day and age where, we have populations on both sides of the conflict who have a desire to understand what's happening. And we're held prisoner to the information that is released by the parties involved. In the West right now, it's very popular to talk about Russia's illegal war of aggression. But one of the interesting things that transpired recently was a meeting between Vladimir Putin and leaders from Africa who traveled to Russia to promote a peace plan. And in that meeting, while the African leaders were actively pushing the idea of a negotiated settlement, Vladimir Putin produced documents that, while they had been alluded to, had never before been presented to the public. And these were the actual draft treaties that had been agreed to by the Ukrainians, indeed initialed and signed by the Ukrainian representatives, that would have brought an end to the conflict on April 1st if the Ukrainians had followed through with their promises and met with their Russian counterparts in Istanbul. Now, history shows that the Ukrainians withdrew from this conference under pressure from the West. Indeed, Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of England, flew to Kiev and put pressure on Zelensky and the Zelensky government to withdraw. But we also now have statements from other Ukrainian officials bragging about how they fooled the Russians, tricked the Russians. This is an important part of the history, I believe, that people need to understand, that it's not Russia that has been pursuing, a war of aggression. It's been Russia that's been pursuing a path towards peace, that this war could have been ended on 1 April. Now, some people will say, yes, that might be reflective of a Russian negotiating tactic after they initiated the invasion. But then that now brings the question, what happened about Minsk? How did Minsk collapse? And the reason why it's important to talk about the Ukrainian posture leading up to the potential 1 April 2022 peace negotiation in Istanbul is that it is reflective of the mindset of the Ukrainians to lie about negotiations, lie about their approach, lie about the desire for peace, which then takes us to the collapse of Minsk in the fall of 2021. And I think it's important for the Russian government to emphasize this, the role played by the West in pressuring Minsk to pressuring Ukraine to walk away from Minsk. The lack of integrity on the part of not just Ukrainian officials, but Western officials in using the Minsk process as a sham, as a shield behind which NATO could train a Ukrainian army. And now we come to the most important point. In order for Russia's special military operation not to be viewed as an illegal war of aggression, one must buy into the Russian argument that it was carrying out preemptive self-defense that is permitted under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. But for this to be accepted, one must have to understand that Ukraine posed an imminent threat to Donetsk, to Lugansk, to Russia in the form of a military attack that was about to take place, and that Russia's only option was to preempt that attack. And this was the question I was going to ask Yevgeny and indeed all other Russian journalists. Where's the evidence of this imminent Ukrainian attack? It's been alluded to by the Russian government, but it hasn't been set forth in sufficient detail to make the definitive cognizable case to the American public and indeed to the Western public. I'm not doubting the Russian government. Indeed, as Vladimir Putin showed in presenting the documents to the African delegations, the Russian government appears to be more than able to back up its assertions with documented fact. But what's lacking here is the documents to back up the Russian assertions of an imminent threat from Ukraine. And this is important because we're coming to the end game of this conflict. And the West is going to have to come to grips with the reality of an inevitable Russian victory. The question now is how to negotiate with the Russians. And I think there's a difference between negotiating with a nation that has carried out an illegal war of aggression and negotiating with a nation that carried out a legitimate act of preemptive self-defense. And I think it's imperative upon the Russian government to better make this case. And it is the duty of Russian journalists such as Yevgeny to push the Russian government to make this case. But as I've said, we live in interesting times, and we need to be empowered with information, and that's one of the purposes of this show. Knowledge is power, and that's what I've tried to assist in bringing about today. So thank you very much for joining me. Again, I apologize for the connectivity issues, but that's what's happened when you try to talk with people who are reporting from a war zone. So until the next time, this is Scott Ritter. Thanks for joining me.